That makes some noise. Great. Okay. So first of all, before we start the session tonight, firstly, can I have everybody check that your phone is on silent? No notifications. Yeah, just check your phone's on silent. Smoking outside, as always, toilets are still in the same place out there by the pool or in the cafe. Okay, we good? Yes. There we go. Okay, so let me introduce our speaker tonight. All the way from Montreal, Canada, I present to you Mr. Ehret. Matt Ehret. Big hand for Matt. Okay, so we actually had Matt speak to us last year, at the beginning of last year. And then later on in the year, his wife, Cynthia Chung, also gave an amazing talk to us. So it's 7:30 a.m. in Canada for Matt. So he got up especially early for us. He does about 20, 30 podcasts a week, if not more. Matt is the editor-in-chief of Canadian Patriot Review. He's a senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He's also the author of the Untold History of Canada book, which is a book series. Actually, he's the author of about 9 books, I believe. Is that right?
I've lost track.
Okay, he's lost track. And also a really good set of books is Clash of the Two Americas. Quite a few people after Matt's last talk last year bought the books. They're quite highly recommended. So also in 2019, Matt co-founded the Rising Tide Foundation, which is based in Montreal, Canada. So today, Matt is going to give us a brief talk off the top of his head. He doesn't need notes on the Anglo-Venetian origins of the deep state. So we'll go for about 30, 40 minutes until Matt gets his next cup of coffee, and then we'll go into Q&A, okay? So we're lucky today because we also have Vincent Dunn, possibly Alex Craner, who have previously spoken to the group, and many other people in Japan and all over the world watching this Zoom talk. So Matt, take it away. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Pat. Thank you. Oh, thank you, everyone. And I'm really happy that that Pat and Amon, my 2 good friends, have invited me back again. And in fact, I have to apologize. I've been invited back to speak a few other times since the first time that I addressed this group, which was still a little bit smaller, and I think only based in one location. I'm seeing things evolving and spreading out as organically as they should in this world, where truth has really become such a high commodity. And I think that as the darkness has really, sometimes the darkness really does need to reach a very high extent of power in order for us to fully appreciate the light, as Martin Luther King Jr. had stated so eloquently 50 years ago. So I think the hunger is very natural. People are finally awakening at a higher density than I've ever seen in my life. And unfortunately, I'm a bit of a night owl. So back to my original apology, I usually don't wake up this early. and today I did wake up with a giant train slamming into me of a virus or whatever that is. I'm sick. And so I do apologize. So I'm going to try to say a few things that will touch on some elements of current events. We're going to go back, as Pat had stated, to some elements as well of how we got here, where this thing called deep state originated. Well, at least maybe not originated in the grand scheme of things, because I don't know if there's been a moment in human civilization's experience that has been devoid of some form of oligarchical manipulation in a continuous fashion, exerting its influence from the top onto the masses of society. So it's difficult sometimes to decide where's going to be a good jump on point to unpack the story. And I guess based on my most recent book, From the Clash of the Two Americas, I got a little cover of it here, actually. It's volume 4 of Clash of the Two Americas. Got a picture of the American flag, the British flag, and a lion. That lion is a symbol of Venice. And the title, so like I said, is The Anglo-Venetian Roots of the Deep State was the title of this one. And the jump off point there is where I think I'll pick it up today. And I think it's going to touch organically on some of those current events that are shaping our future. And just to be clear, when I approach history, and I encourage other people to try this out, and for the best historians that I've really been influenced by and admire, they tend to think in a very similar sort of way, and I've tried to emulate that practice, which is to treat history not as things that happened, but as futures that came into being or didn't, based upon wisdom or folly and corruption. So history is not really just a dead space of things, right? Of events you could plot on a timeline in a linear fashion. It's a battle of different competing concepts of what the future was going to be. The idea of the American Revolution is one shining example of a positive conspiracy that took decades and decades of planning, of thought, of organization, of sophistication on the part of Benjamin Franklin, especially, but also leading figures that he was able to train, to recruit, to train, who had a moral and intellectual fortitude that is really not very, I mean, it's impossible to come by that in our today's Western world. Unfortunately, the U.S. has slid far into mediocrity, especially since the murder of John F. Kennedy. It really took a downward spiral, as I guess everyone here is probably aware. And the nature of the terrain, again, was only made possible by people like Franklin, who recognized that what is more real than the present is the potential of the future, which is ripe with creative potential, right? The future is pure. It's constantly being recreated and created again, based upon the acts of volition, omission, or commission of people who choose, using free will, to detach themselves or to engage themselves onto the stage of history. And as Shakespeare himself had stated, all the world's a stage and we're all players. And that's contingent, though, right? That we take the time to fully understand the topography of the stage. Benjamin Franklin definitely took the time. He didn't waste time. Since a very young age, when he was recruited to John Winthrop and the Mathers Network in Massachusetts and Philadelphia, or actually Philadelphia, there was a network of leaders who recognized his talent and compelled him to make a mission out of his life, which involved recognizing that the cultural framework existent in the 1720s, 1730s, 1740s inside of the colonies of the United States was not really ripe for evolution. The population was, British, mostly British colonials, settlers, not that much deep metaphysics or philosophical thought prevailed. So he had to change that. There wasn't a lot of leadership either. It was completely dominated by British governors, loyal to the British East India Company. There was a lot of evil. The British East India Company was sort of the global Bilderberger group of the day, the one world government, private corporatist system of global exploitation that interfaced very closely then, as it does today, with things like the City of London, the nerve center of global finance. And I'm not talking about the city, but I'm talking about, the city, the square mile. That has its own judiciary, its own police force, that's enshrined with its sovereign rights enshrined in the Magna Carta, of the 13th century, that gives the guilds, the private oligarchical families, more power than any nation on the earth. That's enshrined in the British pseudo constitution. So that was the center of evil. It was animated by certain satanic clubs like the early Hellfire Club, the Rosicrucians, which operated the intelligence structures that had come to dominate the British grand strategy. Sorry, like I said, sick, fighting congestion. Ben Franklin recognized, and his leading allies recognized, this evil. They had to understand it. They had to build up an elevated culture by promoting high literature, the works of Confucius, the works of the ancient Greeks, the Roman philosophers like Cicero had to be published, and there had to be a popularization. So Benjamin Franklin worked very hard to create libraries, public libraries, cultural centers, all sorts of things that would upshift the standards of that society to produce the types of people that needed to come into being in order to carry out the type of revolution that he knew needed to happen. And his discoveries in electricity, he saw as inextricable from his discoveries or his commitment to natural law in the metaphysical and moral domains. Very important idea there too. But it's confusing for a lot of people because for a few, I would say even 15 years or so, he was working with people inside of Britain itself to create things like the Manchester Industrial Revolution that applied the steam engine to undo the need for human slave labor in Britain and increase the productive powers of labor itself, increase internal improvements, create roads, pave the roads, all sorts of things. This was called the Lunar Society, founded by Benjamin Franklin, ironically in Britain in the 1750s, right as soon as he had made a name as the Prometheus of America for his discoveries that no other European great scientist could do. Some hillbilly, who lived with bears in the colonies, all of a sudden trumped all these scientists. So that was a shock for many people amongst the masses and the aristocracy of all countries of Europe. And he made a point to try to make science exciting for the masses, as well as recruit from the better of the nobles of France, of Ireland, and even of Britain, many of the better people who recognized that the system of hereditary power had to go, that he, as somebody not from a high-born family, was able to make this discovery of God's creation and not only translate that discovery of the nature of electricity into new forms of technology and inventions that would benefit and improve the quality of life of people. But that because he could do that, it's sort of a living demonstration. Somebody put somebody on mute there. Sorry. That he was a living demonstration of the fact that the system of the hereditary power structures of oligarchy had to go, right? That the idea that you were born into a certain family and that gave you the rights to control and lord over the slaves, that was not compatible with reality and natural law. So the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, that all men and women have inalienable rights, were made in the image of a creator, and as such, that rights exist because we are human, not because they are given to us or could be taken away by a master class. That's inextricably tied to the scientific proof of his own life having been lived and having worked with many of the other greatest scientist statesmen, Lavoisier of France, who discovered so much in the periodic or in the world of chemistry. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the greatest astronomer of Europe, who was the mayor of France and a leader of the early French Revolution, whose head was later cut off along with Lavoisier's. So that this idea of the moral, metaphysical, political, as well as the scientific improvements, these revolutions were always two sides of the exact same process in the minds of the best statesmen, going back to the ancient Greeks. Plato's Timaeus, for example, that outlines a scientific method that was used by Franklin and by Kepler and by Leibniz and the greatest scientists to make their discoveries of principles of the universe. That method is clearly outlined by Plato in the Timaeus dialogue, as well as in the Phaedo dialogue. And the ideas of political philosophy were not detached as they are today. And the fact that today we live in a compartmentalized world where the realm of science we are told is supposed to be detached from any corruption or any pollution of emotions. Science has to be just objective, descriptive, mathematical, symbolic descriptions of the universe. That's science. No subjectivity, just pure objectivity. And the arts and moral philosophy, that's purely subjective, relativistic, untainted by matters of science. That type of compartmentalization really was done artificially to break us up from the type of integrated human beings that we had to be in order to make a republic and a sovereign society of sovereign nation states function. Because a sovereign nation state, right, like John Adams, the one of the founding fathers, had said, the Republic of the United States, or any republic, only works if you have a moral and religious society, and it is wholly unfit for any other type of citizenry. So the idea of a democratic republic only works if the people in that who make up the community of that society are themselves sovereign, integrated, can think in a way that their mind is guided by their moral values and their conscience. And if that becomes severed too much, if mediocrity takes over, if corruption takes over, then you don't have a republic. You can't. You maybe in name only. And as an admirer of Benjamin Franklin, Gaspard Monge had said, it's better to have Republicans without a republic than a republic without Republicans. Because it's just a shell, right? It's just going to be used as we see in the case of the slide of the United States into tyranny over the past 50 years, especially, but it's been even ongoing before that. If the people themselves detach themselves in any way from their own true being, as well as from the community as a whole, and the idea of the greater good that they themselves are obliged to protect, then demagogues and tyrants will always be able to take control, and people will become instruments for a will that isn't their own, which is unfortunately most of human history to varying degrees. So anyway, back to my point of Benjamin Franklin. People were confused because he originally didn't want to go straight for American Revolution. He thought that it were possible when he was organizing the Industrial Revolution with his collaborators who felt the same way inside of Britain. He thought that there was still something viable that could be redeemed in Britain. It had only recently, maybe a decade before he was born, Britain became really an empire. Before that, it still had something really viable. It wasn't taken over by the Hellfire Club, Rosicrucian occultists yet. So there were still a lot of people who believed in the Shakespearean, Erasmian, Thomas More worldview, the Augustinian, humanist tradition that posited. And again, people like Thomas More, who himself, he had also gotten his head cut off, right? When he he saw that there was an oligarchical operation to split up Christianity into a divide and conquer strategy. And he resisted one of he basically stood up and didn't go along with one of the programs to utilize a very dumb, fiendish, stupid king that he trained originally. It was really sad for him to see his student go nuts, and fall for these sex traps, these honeypots that were set up for him by a Venetian sex advisor named Francesco Zorzi, a leading occultist, and early leader of the Rosicrucian order. So Thomas More was a figure who was a devout Platonic Augustinian humanist, who was he rose to the position of becoming the prime minister of England itself. Until he said no again. The idea of the king declaring himself the head of the church was a bit of a stupid thing to do, especially when kings had already gotten divorced. It wasn't like it was unprecedented. And again, he just fell for this stupid trap. And but his spirit was alive. He still had a lot of admirers. He had a whole school, as did Erasmus, who lived a little bit longer, that endured all the way till the time that Franklin had come into this world. And Franklin saw that there was still a hope in the 1750s, 60s that maybe this grouping could take power again. And I think it was really only with the 7 Years' War against France, where Britain came out hegemonic, defeating France and taking control of all of her, or many of her, global domains, that Britain became sort of the modern form of evil empire that raped, India, destroyed so much of China, ran the Opium Wars, set up the Wall Street apparatus inside of the United States, controlling its fifth columnists, its Scottish Rite Freemasonic operatives, who were always part of British intelligence from the get-go, way before Albert Pike. This was British intelligence, even in the 1790s. So Britain always maintained these fifth columnists. They consciously applied a population control science in the form of the depopulation, periodic famines that they controlled and deployed into India to keep the population broken and in check as possible, so that entire ancient civilization could be better controlled by that master class, using, of course, some organized crime that they would maintain, amplifying the Brahmin system of the castes, that would then become the local warlord controllers on behalf of their London handlers, the wiping out periodically of the Irish as well, the Irish having been a conduit for Augustinian, a very Augustinian moral principle and a political fight, even back in the days of the late Roman Empire. This represented something that the British had been trying to crush periodically and obsessively for well over a millennia, as I'm sure Fintan could say a word or two about that. And the Irish potato famine wasn't about potatoes. There were other things, a lot of other things being grown in Ireland that were not potatoes. The fact that a potato blight happened did not justify 2 million or more deaths of Irish. That was a controlled murder and depopulation program following Malthusian principles. So all that to say, back to my, I have to always pull myself back in, especially when I'm sick. Ben Franklin. So this guy thought there was something redeemable inside of Britain. Why did he think that? Well, because Britain itself, like I alluded to, was taken over by a deep state itself. It had suffered its own takeover, just like the U.S. had over the dead bodies of many presidents, who, and the growth of this foreign directed fifth column. And by the way, it's not Chinese and it's not Russian inside of the United States. This foreign directed fifth column was there and has been groomed and developed since 1776 and even before that. It's British though, and but it's not even really British, as I'm about to say, because Britain itself was taken over. Britain was an island that itself was one of the earliest modern sovereign nation states under Henry VII, one of the great kings, that did a lot to instill and create for. Right after, I would probably say, Louis XI in France was the first. Henry II was his admirer, who followed his example with some really great advisors, one of whom being Cardinal Morton, the éminence grise of England in the 1480s, 90s, who was the mentor of Thomas More, who set out a grand strategy to break up the corruption of the oligarchy, as well as put in reforms that forced the treasuries, by a process of looking for peace treaties and win-win cooperation with your neighbors, to break away from the forever never-ending wars that were being funded at the time primarily by Venice. Venice was the center since the collapse of the Roman Empire, and especially since the Fourth Crusade in 1201, and between 1201 and 1204. Venice had organized a whole network of crusades. It was the center before Britain became the new geographical command center of the empire. Before that, it was Venice. For about 800 years, Venice was the center of global finance. People can look at maps of the maritime monopolies and trade routes of this, this oligarchical society. It controlled global bullion. It was the only people of all of Europe that had full access to the Mongolian trade routes, that could trade with the Mongols and had full access. They, in many ways, I've seen a lot of evidence that demonstrated to me that the Mongols were kind of like a proto-ISIS, used kind of like ISIS is today to destroy target nations, whether Iraq, whether Syria, or anyone else, on behalf of the Pentagon, the CIA, the deep state today. They use these useful idiots, fanatics, who don't even understand how they're receiving their logistical support, funding, and other training. Even they don't even recognize how they're being used. Kind of like the green jihadis of the eco-terror movement, which is unfortunately beginning to see its presence felt across North America, with arson across Canadian forests, derailing of trains, sabotage of pipelines. A lot of these are just clusters, cells deployed by intelligence agents of young misanthropic, idiots recruited and groomed from universities, which increasingly have become centers of intelligence, to go to war and to be deployed to shut down or destroy industrial civilization, with some absurd idea that nature will be better, that will save nature and do the good by annihilating, by basically destroying the means by which human beings survive and thrive. Energy systems, trains that spill chemical waste on farmland. These things are seen as necessary evils to do a greater good, which is ultimately reduce world population. And again, these idiots, just like these ISIS freaks and probably many of these violent extremists in Ukraine, don't even understand how they're deployed. Just like the anarchist cells in the 1880s and 1890s didn't understand how they were being deployed by British intelligence, the Russian Okhrana, to carry out the assassinations of Presidents McKinley, Tsar Alexander II and III, and so many other statesmen. That's part of the way that intelligence operations work, and they always have. The Jacobin movement as well of France, that took the potential of the American Revolution that could have been something beautiful replicated in Europe in the case of France first and then beyond was derailed by this British intelligence bloodbath of the Jacobin terror that killed good and bad alike in a giant 5-year civil war in France that left a complete vacuum of leadership, which could then be filled by Napoleon proto-fascist Bonaparte, funded by the same Rothschild bankers that were, funding his enemies. It's the way the thing works. And that's what was going on in the time when England was becoming the first nation state. And by working with Cardinal Morton, again, the teacher of Thomas More, Henry VII, there was a peace treaty orientation and a focus on looking for points of mutual win-win collaboration around building infrastructure between France and England and the German states and other things. And diplomacy was really important. And with the environment of peace, you could finally turn the treasuries into investments from being investments into war into investments into now building canals and roads and educating orphans to read and other things that were so important to uplift the quality of life of the people and of the society. So that had to come undone. The people, the networks around Morton and Thomas More in the 1508, 1509 period organized something called the League of Cambrai. And in my book, the Anglo-American or the Anglo-Venetian roots of the deep state, I go through the story. These humanists were able to manage a peace treaty that involved creating a new league where all of the nations that were fighting each other for centuries would finally stop fighting each other and declare war on Venice, which was at this point the center of command of the leading Western Roman oligarchical families. Things like the Orsini family, which is to this very day a very major player who had 3 members of the family as popes, several as doges, who could trace their lineage back to Emperor Julian Emperor Julian, of the Roman Empire. These families are still there today. They were still there back then. Back then, their base of operations, like I said, was Venice. And the League of Cambrai was an alliance of all the nations, led by France, Florence, Milan. England was about to join the Holy Roman Empire and the Vatican, all joined together to say, we're going to wipe Venice off the map. And they did. They destroyed Venice's fleets. And before they could come down with a second swipe to finally finish the job, Venice pulled something that I don't fully understand how they did it, but within months, all of a sudden, Venice becomes an ally of the Vatican using a corrupt Pope, Julius the Third, who takes a bribe and pulls with him the Holy Roman Empire with him, because whatever the Catholic Church did at those days, the Holy Roman Empire had to do. So they break free. They have a new alliance with Venice, and all of a sudden, France and Florence become the targets of the attack, and everybody all of a sudden trusts honest Venice. And Venice sort of survives to fight another day, but it's a wake-up call. And Venice realizes that one of the key zones, 2 of the key zones that made this League of Cambrai possible, was located in the leadership centered around the British humanists and the Italians. People like Da Vinci played a role. Leonardo da Vinci played a key role as lead engineer in Florence against the Venetian hordes during that war. But England had to be destroyed, and the Netherlands also had to be destroyed. Netherlands was another hotbed of Republican ideas that had resisted the Habsburg Empire for quite some time. So Venice realized, well, that they had to change geographic locations to something less vulnerable as a point. And so Britain fit the role perfectly. And the next operation took a century to then take over Britain. First, the Netherlands was the first base to be infiltrated, and the humanists in the Netherlands, the revolutionaries, were destroyed. A stock market system was set up based on money worship, and the second private central bank, the Bank of Amsterdam, was created in 1609. That was later used as the template for the Bank of England in Bank of Amsterdam 1609, Bank of England 1694, and that was modeled on the Bank of Amsterdam, a central bank that would be perfectly private, above the powers of the nation state, and that would interface with a new form of economic warfare based on speculation, get people to worship money speculate on the price. In the case of Amsterdam, things like the tulips, tulip bubbles became something you could just gamble on, and people were trading castles for like rare tulips, and not even real tulips, but just the paper notes indicating that this paper represents 50 tulips from Tunisia or something. Ridiculous. But that was a bubble that popped. But it was done because there was those who controlled the bubble, just like today's economic bubble that was created by Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Paul Volcker in the 70s when the Trilateral Commission took over and turned the US dollar into a floating exchange rate, speculative, deregulated basket case. That was always designed to be a bubble that would then pop, like every bubble always has, as a form of economic warfare, knowing that those who manage it don't believe in speculation. They want, money grubbing idiots on the lower levels to play that game while they're in the middle of situating themselves to organize the wealth transfer by selling their assets before the bubble pops, and then buying up for pennies on the dollar the real hard assets, the farms, the factories, the houses. That's what was done in the Great Depression as well. That's always what was done. That was what was done in the tulip bubble. That was what was done later on in the John Law bubble in Britain in 1720. So it's a similar technique that's always been used. Get people who don't know how to integrate themselves with their conscience and their mind as a mature being, a non-sovereign being, get people to be as unsovereign as possible to get them to become their instruments of their own destruction. That's always been the case. This is what the idea of the Republic was always designed to remedy, was a society based, as the Constitution states, on the general welfare, the greater good, but at the same time coexistent with the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that the inalienable rights of all individuals is sacred, and that the two have to coexist, right? You can't, and so the idea that we've fallen into today, that you have to be either a rabid individualist that thinks only that the general welfare is for commie fascist tyrants, or you have to be only for the general welfare to the point that you think that people who think about personal liberty are selfish fiends, right? That don't understand that we have to make sacrifices for the greater good. That we have to make sacrifices. I heard a little echo there. So it's a fake dichotomy that was built up around this fake, are you an Adam Smith or an Austrian school libertarian who thinks the greater good is always fascist? Or are you a Marxist socialist who doesn't believe in personal property and personal liberty, but only the greater good? That was a fake Cold War artifact that was that we fell into in Canada and in most of the West, across the US. We fell into the trap. And we still suffer from a lot of the residues generations after the McCarthyite period that saw the FBI dictatorship taking over on behalf of the Five Eyes run by British intelligence, the GCHQ, MI6. We've forgotten how we were played, and now the spells that were put into our psyche through the trauma of mutually assured destruction are being revived again, where people aren't talking in Canada or the US as much as they should about the takeover by British intelligence, the overthrow of the nationalist factions of the United States over the dead bodies of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, and even what happened in 2020 at the elections. That was completely organized by British intelligence. Christopher Steele, MI6, Richard Dearlove, his employer, MI6, who brought us the Iraq War and the first dodgy dossier. People have lost George Soros, British asset funded by Evelyn de Rothschild in the 1960s and continuously always under the service of British high command. Provable. People have stopped talking about that, and across even the better conservative minds who are aware of the Great Reset and have become aware of the depopulation agenda have been led to believe by a very controlled narrative formation that their greatest enemy is China and or Russia or some mix of the two, but mostly China is sort of the new boogeyman that we're all supposed to hate and fear, just like we were supposed to hate and fear it, and not the actual Rhodes Scholars and British Hellfire Club operatives during the 1950s, 60s, 70s who were killing our leaders and taking over our culture. So anyway, that's I'll round it up, but all that to say, Britain was taken over. The 1688 period was not the glorious revolution as history books have told us. It was a Venetian-directed takeover. Benjamin Disraeli, the former Prime Minister of Britain himself, had stated that the King George, after Queen Anne died, Queen Anne being the last sort of resistance in the monarchy of Britain, who died. She was poisoned in 1714. After her death, the leading factions of the Thomas More, Erasmian, Augustinian humanists, people like Jonathan Swift, Daniel Defoe, who were leading advisors of the government of Robert Harley of the early 1700s under Queen Anne, were all expunged, were either killed or destroyed. And Britain, got a Dutch king, the William of Orange, from the family that gave rise to people like Prince Bernhard, the Nazi officer who created the Bilderberger Group and the modern ecology movement, along with Prince Philip, his bosom buddy Mountbatten. Together, both of them, along with Julian Huxley, created the World Wildlife Fund for Nature in 1961. That was always designed, as they said themselves in their own Morgue's manifesto, to move the value systems of society away from the idea that human beings are sacred and that the good, that which is good, what is based upon liberating human beings from slavery and empire, into a new value system based upon saving nature from humanity. And the fact that these oligarchs who oversaw this shift in our value systems over the course of the Cultural Revolution of the United States and the West, the counterculture revolution, I should call it, that saw the revival of pagan earth Gaia worship. It involved a lot of MK Ultra produced drugs that had to facilitate the creation of this new cultural matrix. It was all based upon oligarchs who despised those people that they wanted to influence and did influence. They despise nature too. The oligarchs are more than happy killing, Prince Bernhard and Philip are more than happy killing rare white rhinos. They don't care about nature, but they will use the idea of be green purely for their own agenda. Just like those Shell Dutch oil, the Anglo-Dutch operations managing and extracting so much wealth from Africa and South America, but especially Africa, to this very day, don't care about nature, even though their operations are used to produce cobalt and rare earths for the solar panels and windmills and electric car batteries that they want to bring in as far as a Green New Deal, which is really just about depopulation, just like the policies of the Irish so-called potato famine actual genocide, or the Indian murders of 25 famines controlled by British intelligence, were always done for the sake of population control. So that's really what it is. And they want us that we'll only go along with this to the degree that we lose sight of our true nature as a species which is sacred, that as beings that are made in the image of a creator, that have inalienable rights, that you can't measure a value of a human life with dollar metrics. To the degree that we recognize that human life is transcendental, and what applies for old cars does not apply for humans. Like grandma might be old and maybe she's not, she costs a lot for society to maintain. She's not paying back into society right now as far as, a worker. But are we gonna justify euthanizing her to save money and provide and save limited healthcare resources? Like we would for our old beat up car that gets too expensive to maintain? It's fine for the car. It's not. As soon as you extend that logic and you don't realize that there's an intrinsic sacredness to human life, well, you've entered the door for, killing useless eaters and fascism. So that's why, for me, I really want to try to keep people focused on the nature of what the hell is actually taken over. Where's the center of command of this evil that has taken over so much of our society? And again, it ain't Russia. It's definitely not China. And in fact, when you look at the topography of the land, and we could maybe talk about this in the Q&A. Sorry, phlegm. The fact is the places in this world today, the reason why the oligarchy has not already been successful at culling the human herd and achieving a one world post nation state government, is because you have nations of Eurasia that have chosen to reject the death cult agenda and have been carrying out a very, very important fight that most Westerners are simply not privy to, or have been mentally inoculated to not understand at all. So instead of, being afraid of Russia and China and their growing array of allies who are doing something very different from what we're doing under the City of London, Wall Street, Five Eyes structure. Instead of going to war with them, we should be working with them, calling for, you know, a real peace process and working to collaborate with these countries in establishing a viable new system that is not going to be based upon a death cult driving for a green depopulation, but rather mutual coexistence and survival based on building big projects, pulling people out of poverty, doing things like we used to do back in the 40s and 50s when we still had some moral viability, and thinking about the next generation by building water projects. You know, we have no high-speed rail in Canada. We have zero, zilch. China has 40,000 kilometers. It's huge, and they're going to double that. So we could do all of those things that involve leaping outside of the limits to growth instead of adapting to scarcity. But our lack of imagination, or I think our lack of historical understanding, the lack of understanding of oligarchical systems and their methodology is causing us to sort of misstep. A lot of good people are misstepping and becoming their own worst enemy. So yeah, I'll just end it with that.
Very much, Matt. If you can hear the applause, there is another one. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Again, you get another bed when you're sick. Much appreciated. Just because of space, I'm going to have people just stay where they are when I pass the mic around, so they won't actually come up. You won't see their face. Okay, so they'll just be asking questions from where they are. Okay.
And ask people if people could speak slowly and clearly into the mic, because the sound quality is not so good. So I have to really stretch my flex my ears to hear you.
Will do. Is that better?
No,
okay.
It's the same thing, but I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, that's okay. Okay, so questions, please. So we have to speak slowly and clearly. Again, guys, so can we go without statements? Questions first.
Thanks, Matt. That was awesome. Absolutely fantastic. Very dense. So much information. If you had to give like 3 points, the key 3 points that were a tipping point for Venetian control of London, what would be the big 3, that we can research and learn more about?
I think the big 3 would be the assassination of viable leadership, specifically Thomas More, who was sort of the Cicero, Socrates figure of his day. So the vacuum of moral leadership that is always so important in carrying out this sort of fight. That was a big reason of how the U.S. was taken over the dead body. It wasn't just the dead body of Lincoln, but it was the dead body of Garfield, President Garfield, President McKinley. Russia was taken over increasingly as well through its own color revolution, through the murder of Tsar Alexander II, Tsar Alexander III. I mean, it's a huge list of statesmen between 1865 and 1914 who were all killed by these anarchist terrorist cells. Huge list, but that had to happen as far as because World War I couldn't be initiated were it not for the destruction of these competent, wise leaders in various parts of the world. Sadi Carnot, the president of France, 1895. So many that had to be eliminated for the fools to be brought into positions of power and be directed then on behalf of the agencies that really hated all players on the stage. Same thing back then. Then I think the other thing was the proclivity towards superstition that made the growth of the Rosicrucian takeover, infiltration of the British intelligentsia possible. That was I think a very big part of the lack of mental rigor and the desire to just believe irrational occultic theories that gave one a sense of superiority through a rite of initiation process over others. That's also a dehumanizing thing. That's a precondition for creating a corrupted elite. You know, the Übermenschen, Untermenschen idea, overhuman, underhuman. As soon as you get people into that elitist sort of mentality of being in the higher caste, that's why they called it the Boston Brahmins. You know, the British directed fifth columnists like Aaron Burr, who killed Hamilton, and the whole like nest that created Wall Street. They were known as the Boston Brahmins because the Brahmin class was the selected caste in India that the British groomed in order to be the local managers of that zone, so that only 10,000 British soldiers needed to physically be there to have 400, 500 million Indians self-control. So that's the other thing. So I'd say with those two, and a people who I guess just were inclined to go along. They there's too much cowardice. So some people had the ability to stand up and to fight when they saw what was coming on. With the divide to conquer strategy within the church, over Thomas More's dead body, the new wars that were being now unleashed between Protestant versus Catholic, all of the it was a shit show, right? And it became centuries of just religious war, of Christians killing Christians, all for these satanic bankers at the top. And those who knew better chose to cower away in fear that they also might lose their heads if they spoke up. So I think those three things, right? Good people doing nothing out of fear, good leaders actually who were not tragic and were moral and courageous, getting taken down, and the growth of this, the corruption of the the elites, the intelligentsia, into what became the proto Freemasons. That's what Rosicrucianism was, as a bridge.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tom.
Hi, Matt. I'm Tom.
Hi.
I'm a fan of your work. I actually bought your book. This is doing some research into the City of London about 6 weeks ago, and yeah, great talk tonight. I also watched the podcast that you did last night, and I believe it was titled "The Anglo-American Origins of the Deep State." The one where you kept getting calls for your wife.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay.
That one.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I may be wrong about the title, but it brings me to the point or the question I'd like to ask. The Anglo-American, Anglo-Venetian, the deep state goes back. We've seen it hop from Washington to London. I'm going in reverse order: Amsterdam and Venice. But how far back does it go? How far back do you see this coming from? Thank you.
I see it going pretty far back, and obviously the more further back you go, the harder it is to sort of follow the paper trail, so to speak. But obviously, like I alluded to, the one particularly important family when I mentioned the Orsinis, people can even Google that. There's a Wikipedia entry on the Orsinis and certain other members of the Black nobility. And I'm not talking about Shaka Zulu, right? I mean these old families that are very proud that they can directly trace their hereditary family tree back to the Roman empires, the Roman Imperium, and Emperor Julian being that one who's a direct continuous bloodline to the Orsinis today. An Italian family, very, very powerful. They tend to stay a little bit more behind the scenes. There's a few others. I don't know. At a certain point, it becomes less useful to like name the names. And I know people like David Martin are really increasingly, talking about the 13 families and these. I think that's a bit of it gets you into a bit of a trap, because if the people, it's kind of like the people who have spent years and years of their lives trying to like figure out all of the names of the different, like 3 shooters from 3 different directions who killed Kennedy. And it's like, but they never bothered asking the question, well, what was Kennedy doing and why was he killed? They get too focused on the names, as if you could just like go, these people are probably like, in their 90s now or dead. And frankly, for the sake of like a lot of the figures, it's good to know them. Like, I mean, I bring up names like Prince Bernhard, Prince Philip, like, some of the leading families. The Coudenhove-Kalergi family is an important family. That goes back to the first the first Crusades, the first sort of clash of civilization strategy over 1,000 years ago. But at the end of the day, it's like if we tolerate our own mediocrity, if we allow that if a culture becomes so mediocre, where stupidity is normalized as it has been due to the past 60 years of cultural decay, then it doesn't really matter if you eliminate like those 13 family honchos. You just get another 13 families who would just do the same damn thing using the same techniques, and we'd be patting ourselves on the back for having like cut off the heads of the bad guys. And that's what the French revolutionaries discovered too. At the end of the day, They thought they did. They cut off a lot of corrupt oligarchical heads back in the 1790s. You know, but they also cut off a lot of good heads too. And that really that made their problems even worse. When they got a Rothschild-funded proto-fascist who wanted to become the new global Roman Empire. But yeah, it goes back far. It goes back really far ways. And I think the most important thing is look at oligarchism more as like a species. It has a certain character to it, regardless of what generation we're investigating. The oligarchical parasite has certain techniques that it will always use, though refined or maybe like modified for the times that it's existing in. But it's very similar, a similar modus operandi. It has similar weaknesses, similar fears and insecurities, which people like Benjamin Franklin understood and knew how to capitalize upon, which I think today's leadership around Xi Jinping and Putin have a pretty good sense of, thank God. And yeah, I mean, it's so look at it as a species of like, almost like you would like a zoological species, this parasite, and sort of like get a feel for it. Cause, and when you investigate, if people want to do work on how the Roman Republic was corrupted and became an empire over the dead body of Cicero, always think about, well, what were the techniques of Cicero's enemies within the oligarchical bloodlines? How were they utilizing the pagan cults, right, that became the governing religious orders of the Roman pantheon, of the Roman society, both for the elites, the soldiers, as well as the people? What about how Athens became an empire over the dead body of Socrates? What was the cult of Delphi? What about the Eleusinian mysteries that were part of the drug cults that were highly Dionysiac, that were part of the conditioning of the elites, as far as getting the elites to depattern themselves and become instruments for a will that they themselves maybe didn't even understand, as far as the creation of a managerial class. That always is something oligarchs need to do, is create a managerial class that would be the expressions of their will onto society, because the oligarch is very few in number and relatively like weak and sociopathic. You know, there's a certain level of brilliance, but brilliance, and I use that in the lamest of terms, because it's committed to evil and irrationalism at the end of the day. But they require degrees of people, human beings, who don't understand how they're being used to varying degrees to be the instruments for their will into the material world. So that the creation of these creatures, these cultists, like you see with Yuval Harari or H.G. Wells, or Kissinger's prodigy, Klaus Schwab, or maybe even Kissinger himself, not even maybe, definitely. They're themselves groomed using techniques. It's not haphazard. There's techniques that have been refined over millennia to make that happen, and to dumb down the people, to get the people to become their own worst enemy culturally. There's techniques for that too. So it's good to explore those things.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. Great answer. I learned a lot from that. Great. Okay, guys. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Tia. I was just wondering, would you say that the Roman Empire never died? And so is right in some way, shape, or form?
Could you repeat that quickly? I'm so sorry. I couldn't really make out the question.
I'm wondering if you see, like, the Roman Empire, or like earlier, it actually never died. It was changed into something else. What's that?
The question was, do you think that the Roman Empire actually never died, and that it was actually continuing but morphing into something different?
Oh yeah, exactly. Yes, agreed.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay.
Hi, Matt. I'm Annabelle, and thank you very much. That was really informative. You were saying, if you cut off 13 heads, then you get another 13 people or another 13 families. Where do you think we are, and how do you? I mean, is it just? It sounds very sort of, I don't know, pessimistic. I don't even know if that's the right word, but where do you think we are? What's the hope for the future?
Well, I think that we are currently, in my analysis at least, in a pretty good spot, ironically, as far as human civilization is concerned. there's a parallel, and one of the chapters of my new book is on the League of Cambrai and the BRI today, the Belt and Road Initiative. The League of Cambrai was something that was tapping into a common principle of what we are currently seeing on a more global stage, in the sense of very different diverse groupings around Europe who finally agreed to stop war and look for and act together in concert on the basis of win-win cooperation and principles of coexistence against a common enemy that had infiltrated and subverted all of them from within, for a very long time, to create constant forever wars, right, and debt slavery. But it was short-lived and undermined. It came undone. Today's situation is interesting because on the one hand, we do have this transatlantic cage, which is a bubble economy that it was set up to collapse, and it is collapsing. The detonation has been set. That's scary, and I live in Canada. I live in the transatlantic, so I'm not enthusiastic about that. And things are going to be, I think, there's going to be storms ahead. A lot of character building experiences, let's just say that, for a lot of people living here. On the other hand, on a global historical level, I've never seen any example throughout all of my research of a situation where ancient civilization states find themselves in a coalition of cooperation on the basis of principle and with an understanding of the nature of the enemy, as we have with the ancient Persian civilization that goes back thousands of years, represented by Iran, China, ancient Confucian, Buddhist cultural traditions that are being revived in a very, very intensive way right now, in Asia, Russia, representing some of the highest quality of Christian Orthodox, orthodoxy that has ever been, under the figure of Putin and his collaborators, Sergei Glaziev, Lavrov, who have created a real bond of survival. A lot of the Muslim world, I mean, has finally found peace, or a hope for viable peace, with the peace agreements that have been set up between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Syria, Turkey and Syria, Saudi Arabia and Yemen have achieved a peace deal now, all brokered by primarily China, which has come in offering something that the West has intentionally not done, which is long-term, mega projects, infrastructure that benefit everybody, the rich and poor alike, and nations, who have been historic enemies are benefiting. China is now trying to take the lead on the peace process between Israel and Palestine. I don't know. I mean, they did miracles with Saudi Arabia, bringing Saudi Arabia on board to the BRI. So hell, I'm open to miracles. If they could speak to some of the saner Israelis who don't want to get burnt to a crisp or turn into Yuval Harari, zombies, then great. Africa also huge hope. There's a huge Pan-African revival movement in the best of the Pan-African movement of that's currently emerging around Ethiopia, but spread all across Africa. Big time South Africa is seeing a big revival of this. Looks to the ancient pre-colonial traditions of Africa, the Black African pharaohs, the ancient great kingdoms of Yoruba, of where today's Mali is located, that had one of the highest levels of cultural development. They're really reviving that. That's what the British and other imperialists who managed Africa for a century have tried to crush, is the spiritual, cultural memory of their past pre-colonial days. So that's what's coming to the fore again, and China's helping enormously even on that, with deep archaeology, putting forth documentaries, videos, shows to try to popularize these deeper ancient traditions to give people a better sense of their identities. So yeah, that's all good stuff, like really good stuff. I could go into more detail, but I wrote a book called Breaking Free of Anti-China Psyops. It's more of a special report, 80 pages, pretty short, but it goes into details of all the different things China's doing differently from the West, with Russia, China as their collaborators.
Thank you. Can you just show us the cover again of the book?
Yeah, it's here. It's actually my wife and I just got back from Japan. We got a Japanese publisher who reached out to us and asked to publish it. So it's going to be on the Japanese market next week. Apparently, there's some Japanese who don't want to get caught in the nuclear crossfire like of a proxy war between the US and China, as so many Iranians have discovered. So that's cool. That's a cool thing.
Great. Thank you for the answer. Okay. Let me just, anyone else for a question? I have a question from Anthony down the back.
Yep.
Tones, actually. Hello, I haven't actually seen your podcast, but I liked what you said about Julian Huxley and his depopulation agenda. Of course, he founded UNESCO on that premise, looking for an environmental disaster to bring this about. And they finally got lucky with global warming. I want to ask you, do you think that climate change should be fought from the understanding that it's a depopulation agenda or it's a new world order agenda? Because I think when you do that, you're actually losing the argument and you're going past the sale, which means that you're already accepting that global warming or climate change is real. We're just arguing about why you should fight against it as opposed to arguing the science. So although we know that climate change is scientists support the depopulation agenda, and so do many elite groups are in there for the depopulation agenda. How do you think that argument should be fought? With that argument of depopulation or on the science?
It depends on your audience, and it depends on your level of knowledge, how much work you put into develop an understanding of what you're talking about. And I think the biggest damage that tends to happen is people who tend to speak more than they think, or they speak prematurely before coming to turning their thoughts or theories into, or hypotheses into knowledge, which requires a lot of work. So it's good to be silent and thoughtful much longer than a lot of people are before speaking. So in that sense, again, look to your audience and make sure you don't skip steps. And I think if you really, really understand the science of oligarchism and what has been behind the manipulation and corruption of science as a whole, including the arts, like the arts and the sciences, neither one in the 20th century were unaffected by the political agendas of those who wanted to enslave us. You can understand both, how both happened as part of a one unifying process. But again, it takes work and time. If you can discover it and communicate it, we'll do so. And if you know that the overarching agenda was to bring in a Malthusian eugenic pseudo religion, to justify a depopulated slave class, if you've come to know that and can speak about it, and your audience is relatively open-minded enough, if you've deemed that they're so, then speak about it. But yeah, I mean, it's important to also know the science. Like how did a bunch of smart people go along with, PhDs galore, go along with this medical monstrosity for the past 3 years, especially, but it's been going on before that. How did the medical science get corrupted? Because that's not that different in terms of the technique of corruption as what was applied to the study of climate science over the past 60 years, especially with Rockefeller Foundation funding of different universities that encouraged a certain type of mathematical modeling that became a substitute for thinking. And people began to think that, in order to know the future, all we could do was plot selected data sets given to us by who knows who, right? Who's controlling the data sets, the data centers that then give that select what is acceptable data sets and what is ignored, that disrupts the outcomes you want the computer models to already have. Who controls the programs that read the data and do the extrapolations into the future, right? The Monte Carlo analysis, for which its founders were given Nobel Prizes, these mathematical probability theorists who denied the existence of truth ontologically. These are people who were given Nobel Prizes and whose models became the basis of Rand Corporation mathematical models, Club of Rome mathematical models, that all talked about how we can know the econometric modeling that was used by Wall Street and other stock market brokers. It was all based on the idea that that reality is only known through probabilistic rolling of the dice types of thinking, using computers to think for us with a high priesthood of experts who are peer reviewed, who are the end all on truth. So that's exactly what happened for the medical dictatorship stuff. Or the medical hoax stuff. That's what happened for the climate change stuff. And the variables that demonstrate that we're in a global warming pause, that we've been in a global warming pause since 1999, that climate change has been ongoing, that it was getting cooler between 1945 and 1977, and we were all, that the expert community was thinking about an ice age, which is actually what we're probably looking at today, since we're at the end of the Holocene warming period. By a long shot, we should be expecting to dip back into another prolonged ice age, not global warming. That's what the actual geological records are showing us, that we're living in an ice age. And every, like 8 to 10,000 years, you get these every 80,000 to 90,000 years of ice age, you get these little warming blips for about that last maybe 8 to 12,000 years. And then it goes back to the normal cold, which has been there for 2 million years. And we're at the tail end of the Holocene warming that began about 10,000 years ago when the ice caps melted and you had flood myths around the world. So we should be planning and organizing ourselves to deal with that problem, not global warming caused especially by plant food, CO2.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Just 3 questions, Matt. That was brilliant. 2 questions. Erin?
Hi, Matt. My name is Ehret. I did mathematics in my degree and then master's in finance. So if you see a student of mathematics in the university, what advice would you give the kid? Because I do think I did partial differential equations and applied to the pricing of derivatives. I did not agree at all with the finance industry. But as a pure mathematician, I do think it's still a really important subject because it does develop your critical thinking. That's why I'm I have my own thoughts and all that stuff. So what would you say to a student today how to take their career forward like 30 years down the line after union, or where should they be heading? Because for me, I was coached by financial institutions, and you kind of just, you're good at math, so you go into finance, full stop. I didn't get really good advice. So what would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, math is so important. And I guess there's been this artificial sort of sleight of hand that's been thrown onto us. And there's a figure named Lord Bertrand Russell who played a big role in this over a century ago, and another guy named David Hilbert, who Hilbert put forth a series of problems at this mathematical conference in 1900, Conference of International Mathematicians, to solve, to basically create a new integrated integration of all the different branches of math. And one of the things that Hilbert put forth was, can a new integrated system, sort of like a new Principia Mathematica, be created that describes the entire universe using mathematical symbolic logic that is reducible to a finite series of axioms and postulates? And it was a very robust world at that time. You had Max Planck, you had Einstein, you had Madame Curie, overthrowing the conservation of energy laws, looking at radiations, and I mean, it was really, everything was just very robust and creative at that moment. And so all of the old presumptions of math were being challenged by the new discoveries being made in physical reality. And so sometimes a discovery in physics happens without having a mathematical symbolic language to describe what the hell just happened. What is this idea that has been discovered, right? It takes time to figure out what's an appropriate symbol to wrap around it so that it can be better communicated and recognized as a bit of a constant upon which other, like, sort of a foundation upon which more structure can be built. But Hilbert and especially Bertrand Russell believe that there should be an absolute cage, that these limited axioms as foundation upon which every every other everything follows from our assumptions, right? You start with an assumption, and then you build upon that, and math is a perfect example of that. As soon as they wanted to have something, as Bertrand Russell stated, and he outlined it in his Principia Mathematica 3-volume series, co-written by a fellow Cambridge apostle named Alfred North Whitehead, that the entire universe could be known if you just got the right data, plugged it into your system. You could extrapolate in a linear fashion everything from the beginning of creation all the way till the end of the heat death of the universe, which Bertrand Russell was a devout believer in, the ultimate teleological heat death of non-existence that was animating and governing all existence forward into this, entropic blah. That's sort of one of the religious articles of empires, entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, that they just impose onto the universe, despite the fact that the universe itself showcases all of these miraculously beautiful qualities of creativity and going outside of itself to introduce new states of organization. Despite all of the evidence, they always go back to just saying, no, it's ultimately just heat death. We're like a giant engine slowly using up more energy than we're producing as a universe. And thus there's really, it leads you into a very nihilistic set of conclusions if you think it through. Like, well, what's the point of living a good life or being disciplined if it's all meaningless anyway? Might as well just, get my rocks off and, maximize my pleasure, avoid my pain now at the end of the day. So the math thing, I think what is really valuable is look at what, instead of looking at Bertrand Russell as a guide, and Bertrand Russell was sort of the founding father of modern cybernetics. His student Norbert Wiener was the one who took the challenge of his teacher to create a practical new science of control based upon the Principia system set up by Russell. And he did that in the form of the creation of cybernetics, which became the package around which eugenics was retooled and rebranded after World War II, and infiltrated in every institution you could imagine. So I think, the important thing is to recognize that Bertrand Russell never discovered anything. He came up with theories and he imposed them, but he never discovered anything. So look to people who are great mathematicians but made discoveries. So like Max Planck, read his philosophy of physics. I'd encourage all math students to just go back to the look for the people who put their thoughts down about metaphysics and philosophy and were mathematicians, but made real discoveries. So read Einstein's, theories of metaphysics. Read Leibniz, who, we're told, Leibniz and Newton co-discovered the calculus. No, that's bunk. Leibniz published his works. He actually showed how he discovered the calculus, what he was doing by measuring physical curves in physical space-time. Newton, which is why Bertrand Russell called his system the Principia Mathematica, because the Newton system had just gotten overthrown, and Newton, another Cambridge apostle who was the master of the mint for the Bank of England in 1694. That's Isaac Newton, an occultist Rosicrucian freak who was given to us, repackaged by a whole bunch of Royal Society handlers who were in the middle of taking over Britain and destroying their humanists. They needed to find a figure around which they could attribute the discoveries that they were plagiarizing from great scientists, great Augustinian Platonic scientists like Leibniz, like Kepler, the great astronomer who people can read his writings, his Harmonies of the World. Here's the thing. I would encourage students to for $100 you could buy Kepler's Harmonies of the World, where he lays out how he discovers his third law of planetary motion. You can actually read it, and he makes it very clear that he's looking at the harmonics, the geometry of sound that is created by understanding the sound of a triangle, the sound of a square. Not esoteric, but you can actually create a square, build it with a compass alone, and then divide a circle in that you circumscribe around the square, and build it, and then build a triangle in that same circle. Divide that circle by 3 or by 5, build a pentagon, and your mind doesn't just assume the existence of a pentagon or a square or a triangle, but it discovers that there's a process of creation that you can know when you use the term square, the 3, the 4, the 3, the 5, and then you could even find the according harmonics, the proportions of 3 to 4 as a sesquitertiate, and listen to the sound of a division of 3 to division of 4 on a string, and compare it to the 2/3, the sesquialterate, as Kepler calls it, which is the basis of his third law of planetary motion, the square cube law, right? The periodicity, the square of the periodicity of any planet has a relationship to the mean cube of the planet to the sun. That square cube relationship maintains a constancy throughout the entire system. Max Planck found that very vital in his work on quantum oscillations and the quantum of action. So that, there's all of this stuff that that mathematical students are being deprived of because they're being told to memorize too much the formulas, and they're being chastised if they ask, like, well, why is the formula true? Why is the Pythagorean theorem true? What's the physical proof? How is Pythagoras thinking when he discovered the formula that I'm being told to memorize? And they're being told either it just happened that way, or they're chastised for even asking the question, and it kills the passion, and it destroys the ability to improve upon the system in a qualitative way. And instead, we're told if we want to be creative in mathematics, we have to just use probability theory, the rolling of the dice, shit happens science, instead of just looking at, well, how did science actually,
I totally
grow?
agree. When I said I want to continue in PhD in maths, and I was asked, how are you going to make money out of it? And I was like, I don't know. So that's the usual reply when a student wants to go deeper. The answer always, how are you going to live off that?
Keep it practical. Yeah, it kills the spirit. So toxic. Yeah.
So Matt, thank you, Ehret, for the question. Thank you for that answer. I didn't know you were an astronomer as well. That was amazing. Look,
maybe I can put in a question there.
Yeah. Can I just go to the last question, and Fintan, finish off the session with the last question, please?
Yeah, just thanks for the talk. Very learned, very deep. And just to the last comment there, I mean, if we go back to Plato, if we go back to the Platonists, the roots of everything are there. I think where mathematics went astray is that it just became mathematics and not shape. If you can't explain the world in shape, you're never going to explain it in mathematics, because at least with shape, you have some chance of being able to visualize what it is. Whereas with mathematics, you lose that. And the dumbing down of education has been central plank of what they've achieved. So you've really articulated that well. I think it's refreshing to realize that your views on the origins of the deep state integrate and intersect with those of Sergei Glaziev, who's a close advisor to Vladimir Putin, which shows that really there's a global awareness now starting up as to the nature of what we're involved in. But I'd like to pull it back to your first edition of The Clash of Two Americas, and to chapter 10, understanding the trifold nature of the deep state. Could you just lay out what are the 3 legs of that stool that you referred to, without going into a great deal of depth, but just give us some insight into this trifold nature of the deep state?
I'll say it, I guess, in the quickest way possible, because I know you guys probably have a time limit. But in that particular chapter, I use as my jump off point the murder of Lincoln and how the British created the Civil War in America to undo 1776. And in looking at the murder of Lincoln and those who were trying to sabotage the Union during the course of that trial, there's 3 factions that play a very big role. Number 1 are the United Empire Loyalists of Canada, that were always the British traitors, right? That wanted to stay loyal to the British Empire when 1776's fight was beginning. That's why I'm an English speaker in Canada, not a French Canadian. It's because they were given sanctuary in British possessions, to the north, and they became sort of like a cultish, almost like imperially religious culture around the Masonic Orangemen, the Orange Order, which played a very, very negative role throughout the last 250 years. The Orange Order, based upon the system, a secret society built up around William of Orange, and that played a very big role in destroying a lot of Republicans and good movements in Ireland as well as in Canada. So that was part of it, is the growth of that thing. And the Confederacy operation had their intelligence operations very active in Montreal and Toronto and Halifax, that provided to them for the British. So John Wilkes Booth was up here as well, launching Lincoln's assassination, or being deployed by his handlers to launch Lincoln or carry out Lincoln's assassination. Then you had the New York Copperhead Democrats, who were nominally abolitionist, anti-slavery, but in reality were always working. They were Wall Street for the most part. The Boston Brahmins, acting like they were anti-slavery, but in reality were working always economically very closely with the slave power in Virginia, as well as with the handlers of the great game in London, working to sabotage Lincoln from within. And that's the basis of Lincoln's greenbacks, when he couldn't even get his own northern power brokers in the banking community to provide him loans to carry out the war at anything less than 30%. He was like, well, how about we just use constitutional banking, Article 1, Section 8, and create our own currencies issued by the Treasury instead, which worked damn well. It's called the greenbacks. It took them years to destroy that. The third faction is still there. It's more the Virginia faction of the slave South that came to power under the KKK, under Albert Pike, the reorganizer of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and things like the Jim Crow laws, all of these things that re-empowered the white supremacist faction of the elite over the course of the 20th century, aided by J. Edgar Hoover, another Scottish Rite, 32nd degree Mason. Also a big part of that. So it's these three different sort of pillars in America, at least. Other countries have their own deep states expressing itself a little bit differently.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you for the question. So Matt, again, thank you so much. I mean, we're just in awe of your knowledge. It's incredible. And thank you again for getting up so early in Canada. If you send me the links to your books, and I'll post them in the group, I'm sure there'll be many people interested in getting them. So once again, everybody, a big hand for Matt. Ehret. Thank you so much. Okay, you get back to bed, buddy. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks everyone.
Thanks,
right,
everyone.
bye.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. Okay.